The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to today's webinar. On behalf of New Food and LGC, I'd like to thank you all for attending. I'm your moderator, Bethan Grills, editor of New Food. Today's speakers will be Dr. John Sprinks, Assistant Professor at Michigan State University, Selvarani Elahi, MBE, Deputy Government Chemist at LGC, and Moya Ruri, Global Product Manager at LGC. Following their presentation, we will move on to a live question and answer session where you can pose questions to today's speakers. You can submit questions at any point during the webinar using the questions panel situated in the menu on the right. I will now pass over to today's first keynote speaker.
Thank you very much, Bethan, for that introduction. So today we're going to talk to you about what food fraud is and the global drivers that allow it to happen. And then I'm going to hand over to my co-speaker, Dr. John Spink, who's going to tell you all about the key aspects of a food fraud prevention strategy. Then John will hand back to me to tell you a little bit about the Food Authenticity Network. And then I'll hand over to Maura, who's going to talk to you about key considerations for testing in a food prevention strategy. And then John will wrap up the webinar with some conclusions. Next slide, please. So what is food fraud? There's a lot of different definitions around the world on what food fraud is, but there's no legal definition. The different types of definitions that come from the world can often cause confusion because in different territories in the world, it means slightly different things, and sometimes this can be a barrier to international trade. Next slide, please. For this reason, the UK government funded a project to review the current major global definitions of food fraud with the aim of updating the Food Authenticity Network that I'll speak about later, and also inputting into global efforts to standardise definitions for food fraud and related terms, which I did by presenting at a European standardisation meeting for food authenticity on the 19th of January 2021. Next slide, please. This is a process that we used. So we looked at the current scientific literature over the last 10 years, covering just before the 2013 horse meat incident, all the way through to 2020. We also then looked at the current non-scientific literature to see what expert groups around the world were telling us. Then we spoke to experts from both within the Food Authenticity Network executive team and other global experts on this topic, including Dr. John Spink, who is speaking today. Next slide, please. And this is what the project found. So for food fraud, we found that there were 10 commonly cited definitions in the scientific literature, about 15 common food fraud definitions in the non-scientific literature. We also found that there were common terms for other related terms such as economically motivated adulteration, food authenticity, food integrity, and food crime. And then there were also definitions for 11 different types of food fraud. And now this work will soon be published, but I can show you what the most common 10 definitions for food fraud we found in scientific literature were. Next slide, please. I'm going to show these over the next 2 slides, and the first 5 common definitions are shown on this slide here. I'm not going to read each one in turn, but what I did do is sort of highlight the most common terms used within the definitions. So anything relating to sort of intent, so a deliberate act is highlighted in black bold, and anything talking about financial or economic gain is highlighted in red. So you can see along these definitions here, they all have both those highlighted terms. Next slide, please. And again, in the second set of definitions, so definition 6 to 10, most of them have both terms. I think there's only one that just has economic gain and doesn't talk about intent. And you may also notice it's no coincidence that Dr. John Spink has had a hand in more than 5 of these 10 definitions. Next slide, please. So it's very clear from all of these definitions that the 2 common words around the definitions are around intent and financial gain. So food fraud is a deliberate act committed by someone intentionally who's motivated to make money. Next slide, please. So now we know what food fraud is. Let's look at some of the global drivers that allow food fraud to occur. Next slide, please. This is a subject of a funded project that LGC is currently working on in collaboration with Dr. John Spink, Professor Chris Elliott of Queen's University Belfast, and John Points of John Points Consulting. It's made up of 2 phases. The first phase was focused on identifying global drivers for food fraud, and then the second phase is to look at what tools are out there that could help us mitigate and prevent food fraud from happening in the first place. We've just completed phase 1 and we're starting phase 2. But with DEFRA's permission, I'm able to share our preliminary findings with you today. Next slide, please. So the literature review showed that the overriding driver, as we've just said, for food fraud is financial gain. And I've seen many reports now that say that there's more money to be made from food fraud than from narcotics because everyone in the world needs food. However, for food fraud to occur, you need someone motivated to commit it, but they also need an opportunity for them to commit it. So we found that the literature pointed to the fact that macroeconomic factors create the opportunities for fraud. System weaknesses within organisations or the supply chain enable the fraud to be perpetrated, but it takes individual criminality for the fraud to actually happen. If you take away any one of these things, then in theory, you prevent the food fraud from happening. Next slide, please. We then held an expert workshop almost a year ago now that was chaired by Professor Chris Elliott. We had 42 attendees from stakeholder organisations from around the UK, and we asked them what are the global drivers of food fraud that are likely to impact the UK in the next 5 to 10 years. The expert workshop identified 476 drivers, which were identified, and then we asked them to group them in PESTLE categories. So that's political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental. And then these were prioritised, as you see here, to identify those that the group felt were very important and certain to impact the UK in the next 10 years. And these are identified by the top left quadrant with the red amber type bubbles. There's a lot going on in this slide, so I thought I'll just draw out that quadrant into a separate slide. Next slide, please. And that's what this slide here shows. So at the time we held it in the UK, we had our EU exits going on, so you can see that was one of the overriding factors that people were pointing to. So there's a lot of concern over the EU exit process, what that would mean in terms of border checks and changes to standards and legislation in view of new trade deals. Climate change featured, both in terms of causing natural disasters, disease, crop failure, etc. All of these potentially leading to supply chain shortages. Criminality was identified both at an organisational sort of organised crime level, but also recognising that, as we just said, the individual criminality is often what tips the balance between fraud happening and not. So both need to be considered. Consumer-led demand for food can drive certain, can create a demand which creates opportunity, for example, for organic food or for vegan foods, as we're seeing at the moment. Legislation loopholes, so where there's uncertainty in legislation, or legislation doesn't keep up with current practices, that sometimes creates opportunities for fraud. Price pressures, and we're always seeing that where there's a desire for either cheap food or, on the other side, desire for very high commodity price foods such as organic foods. Lack of enforcement due to reduced resources, and certainly we're seeing that not just in the UK but all across the world, and especially in the current circumstances with the COVID-19 restrictions in place, we know that regulatory surveillance isn't at the level that we would like it to be. again, that creates an extra opportunity. Complex supply chains was identified, and we'll recognise that we have true global supply chains now. And again, that makes oversight of the whole process more difficult. Felt that even when we did catch people perpetrating fraud, the penalties often associated with committing the fraud are low, so don't act as a deterrent. Food shortages due to depletion of natural resources was also identified, and even though the pandemic hadn't started, then pandemics again were identified as a potential for creating opportunities for fraud. So now you know what food fraud is, and some of the global drivers are acting to allow food to happen. I'm going to hand over to John now, who's going to tell you what you can prevent it from happening. Next slide, please, and over to you.
Okay, everybody, welcome. Thank you, and for all the organizers here, it's a pleasure to be a part of this. You know, it's almost a little bit embarrassing for me to see 5 different definitions that I had for food fraud over the years, but maybe let's talk about that just a second before I start in here. Really, the key is that over time, the concept's evolving, and I think that's with definitions, those have evolved over time a little bit, and that's a good thing. And it's also good that we're getting those into academic peer-reviewed journals, so we have something like this review to talk about. The bottom line, the general concepts are there, and that's a key from that previous DEFRA research as you saw. So I'm going to cover food fraud prevention strategy, and the key we're looking at here is to get into what's required, so we can see what countermeasures are optimal, and then how to select those countermeasures as well. That's a big issue for everything, for all of us. So first, a little bit about me and resources. So key. I get this question a lot. Someone wants to start a program, they don't know where to start. And one thing that we've looked at is policy and strategy. And that's different from some other groups. We don't do any testing, we don't gather data. It's really looking at how things are managed. And the real key there was everything came together in the food fraud prevention textbook. So that's there on the right. That's intended as a comprehensive review. And then also, if you're starting in the programs, there are some very extensive free online courses. So we have what we call MOOCs, Massive Open Online Courses, and you'll notice there's 6 of them there, all the way from basics, and then the number 5 in there is developing an organic fraud prevention plan that was developed by us with the Organic Trade Association. So it's working with people in their fields to really get some application, a new enterprise risk one, and then 2 with the USDA, funded by the USDA to look at the national organic programs. So starting to engage with regulators to look at best practices internally and externally, and then of course a lot of different types of programs. So there's some basics out there that you have some resources. You're not on your own. So to build upon the food fraud definitions, we are going to look at the types of fraud, because you don't just protect against food fraud, you protect against specific type of actions. And that's why it's important to have things like incident databases to look at what incidents are occurring and look at details of those. So within food fraud, if we look at the GFSI, the Global Food Safety Initiative approach. Now, you might not have heard of GFSI, but GFSI is the foundation for food safety management systems that are required. And those would be things like BRC, FSSC 22000, SQF, IFS, and others. So GFSI is the foundation, like ISO is the foundation for a lot of other standards. And it breaks down into 4 main categories. The first is adulterant substances. Those are things put in or taken out that we could actually measure or count or test for. Mislabeling or misbranding, this is very broad. And this is something very challenging because things like country of origin, cherries from the state of Michigan versus the state of Wisconsin, they could be nearly identical, but it would be very hard to identify that they are fraudulent because they'd be mislabeled. Gray market production, theft, and diversion. So illegal, if something's stolen and gets back in the marketplace, that's illegal product. So that's a real key, that's product that a company needs to protect against as well. And then counterfeiting. And we need to be careful using the word counterfeiting because it might be in the dictionary as just something that's fake. Really, the insinuation is that that's intellectual property rights infringement. So that would be like the violation of a copyright. So that's a real key on that point there. So here's what we've got as the types of fraud. For things like authenticity testing, the adulterant substances is really one of the most straightforward areas. Now, with mislabeling, misbranding, sometimes there might be some differences between those Wisconsin and Michigan cherries that we might be able to identify. But things like gray market theft and diversion, that's genuine product. So any authenticity test would just confirm that it's genuine, which is good, but not that it was not fraudulent. So when we also look at what companies need to do to protect themselves, say a food company, then when we're looking at how we're going to provide services to them, we need to look at where fraud occurs and where they're focused on it. And you'll notice the far right is the consumer. So if you are a food company, you're worried about all types of fraud, and that's a key. And if we're trying to help companies with their authenticity testing, we need to understand that these food companies are looking at a lot of things beyond just adulterant substances. Also, a key is beyond just incoming goods. There's such a focus because there is naturally a higher fraud opportunity in that inbound product, the raw materials coming in. That's where we do a lot of testing. We test for horse meat and beef, melamine and whey protein powder and other things like that. But fraud can occur in operations or in finished goods. That's stolen goods, maybe product that's seconds that are supposed to be destroyed that come back in the market, or technology transfer. That could be contract manufacturers or others. And then product completely outside the supply chain. And that is just mind-numbing for people because that's counterfeit product. And that's still your product in the marketplace. So just to step back to say, the food company has a lot of areas they need to focus on, a lot of types of fraud, and a lot of places fraud can occur. So what do companies do? Companies are required by GFSI to do two things. One, conduct a vulnerability assessment, a food fraud vulnerability assessment, and second, a food fraud prevention strategy. And what you'll see is a lot of companies have a one-page summary, and there on the left, you'll see the rank, which is a heat map, and you could identify which ones are the worst problems. And on the right is a method that they would use to implement it. That's a lot of what we do with management systems. I'm in the business college. I'm in supply chain management. We look at those type of systems. A key for companies that are providing services is to look at, number one, on the left is what are the biggest problems? So if you go to someone, let's say medical, if you come to me with a great cancer medicine, I think that's wonderful, but I don't have cancer. At least I don't think I do. So you're not going to sell me that cancer medicine. Now, right now, if you had a COVID-19 vaccine, I would be a very, very big candidate for that. Now, would I pay $100,000 for a dose? No, but at least I'm more of a candidate than I would be for the cancer drug. That's a key to look at that risk and the vulnerability of a specific company, and then you can align your products and services to help them with what their problem is. The second on the right is this management system. Where does the decision making come in to look at those countermeasures? And I'll cover that next. So on the right, you'll see the food fraud prevention cycle, and this was developed with industry to try to coordinate all these activities, all this information coming in. And one of the co-authors was one of my business college colleagues, and actually two of the co-authors were from Mars Food. And so that was a part of the implementing through GFSI and others, looking at these systems to get these into the academic literature and get them reviewed. Something you'll notice there is that it's a cycle, constant cycle. And there in the middle are these countermeasures, the place to review countermeasures. And countermeasure, the values are defined by the contribution to prevention. Yes, it's important to detect, but really overall, you really have the most impact, and the management system is looking at prevention. And we want to proactively present the food fraud corporate risk map in something like this that's proactive, looking at the prevention, and recalibrate likelihood and consequence as we have more information. So you'll see that cycle go. Now, if you have a new countermeasure, the new types of countermeasures and information is constantly dynamic. So there could be differences in traceability, testing, investigation, or audit. Those all would be considered in this function, step 6, that is countermeasures there. So we have a place for that information to come in to be processed, then it would be considered new information, and then companies would decide and be able to evaluate whether that would help their problem to get within their risk tolerance. So back just before getting into the real key slide of the amount of detect, deter, and prevent type of testing that can be expected, is to really identify and reduce the system weaknesses. So on the right is the crime triangle from criminology. The goal is not to catch food fraud. The goal is to prevent it from occurring in the first place. Now you need to be able to detect it first, before you can deter it and prevent it. So just to give you a little background, detect in the detect mode would be finding the specific adulterant substance or the product anomaly. So let's say that we know that pets are getting sick. We identify that that is melamine. Now we would go do a melamine test. If it's in the middle of an outbreak, we would test a lot of product, maybe every product that's on the shelf in incoming goods. Next is deter. So it's a targeted countermeasure to stop one specific type of food fraud or fraudster. So as we're moving forward to say, well, we did the detection tests, we don't have melamine in our system, but now we want to monitor because we know that bad people are putting melamine into whey protein, whatever it is, the ingredients we're putting into the infant formula and pet food. So we would then put something in place that looks specifically for melamine and specifically from the types of suppliers that would be supplying that had the fraud opportunity. That's deter against a specific fraudster. Then we move on to prevention. This is the goal. It's the application of countermeasures that reduce the fraud opportunity overall. So it's putting plans in place that a fraudster looks at, so say it's a burglar that walks down the street and they look at your house and they see the door shut, deadbolt on, light on, ring doorbell with the video, dog barking, your fence around your yard. You're not an attractive target. All those countermeasures that might be simple, the ring doorbell, the getting a dog, having a fence, having lights on, those could be very inexpensive and simple, but together they create prevention. Now, does that specifically detect or deter? Well, it sure does deter because they'd have to break your door and detect, like the ring doorbell. If it's got the video, that could definitely detect it by looking at that type of alarm. So that's the big picture. We're trying to put these concepts into that frame. And then, so here before looking at the role of testing is from the food fraud prevention book, it goes into great detail in this, is implementation. And it's a question of scale. And this is really important as you're thinking about the tests that you could develop, is to understand what the market is. And food fraud, originally, there was this expectation that food fraud testing requirements would be double food safety times 2, but that's not the case. And we'll look at that in detail here. So first off, is that first column in the green is detect. And this is a thorough review of a few products for a short time. Think about that like melamine in the industry with products that are making pets sick. So if you're a company that makes pet food and human food, you wouldn't test all your product at that point. You'd be looking at just a few products. Let's say that those two, product A and product D, are both pet foods. Then you would look for that and you would test a lot of product, at least for a short period of time. And then next is deter. So we know that that's product A and product D, it's in there, but you know what? We also have some similar products that are in that human food for whatever column B is. So over time, since we know there's a type of fraudster, type of act, we would do a little bit of testing. Remember, we already tested, made sure that melamine wasn't in their system, but you do a little bit of testing, but very specific, in a very specific area. And then third, in the far right in the orange, is prevent, a broad review of all products for insight and also to scare skittish fraudsters. Key is this is not smash and grab criminals that are drug addicts trying to get their fix tonight for tonight, and they're risking going to jail today. These are people that have invested in the marketplace and they've invested in their products. So we're trying to lead the fraudsters to be skittish, to think that they might get caught. So from a prevention standpoint, it's very wise to look at all products, but just a little bit. You want to test a little bit of it. You want the fraudsters to realize that if they try to do something, they might get caught. They don't know exactly what you're doing in the test, but they know you're testing a lot of different things and you're finding things out there. So prevention in that sense is very, very low amount of testing. Now, key here is to think about yourself, like medical tests, blood tests. So I'm 54. I go to the doctor once a year, so I go have blood tests once a year. And now they're taking more vials every time I go, so maybe I just moved from prevention. If I was 20 years old, then I'd had very few blood tests, but now I might be into deter, looking at specific type of things that could occur for 54-year-old men. So I have more tests, but I'm not in the detect mode. Now, if I was recovering from cancer or had certain type of ailments, then I might be getting blood tests once a month, but only for specific activities. So that's a way to think about that with the blood test examples. And then it gets us back to here specifically the role of authenticity testing. So whenever you're thinking about how to move a plan forward, Even if someone's in the middle of one of those melamine type incidents and they've got to go do detection, yes, you can go serve them in that, and that's really important for the first step. But you always need to think about support and reinforce prevention. That's the ultimate goal. That's the long-term plan. And if you talk about strategy and you understand that, then you're going to have more value to your customer. But you do, you start with detection or deterrence, yes, and of a specific fraud act. So if they ask you just to test for melamine, get more information, understand why they're asking you to test for melamine, where, what type of fraud act occurred, and on what specific product, and also at what specific supply chain weak point. At that point, if they're only looking for product A on that chart of A, B, C, D, then you might say, well, you know what, you're testing A, but product D is also pet food. You might want to test that as well. And oh, by the way, product B does have some similar attributes. We recommend you test that as well. So you're adding a lot of value. And then how, when, why, where, and by whom test methods can be applied actually to achieve the goal. Now, if you're just trying to find out if the product in your warehouse is bad, then you know exactly where to go. But when we're starting to look at prevent, we're looking across the marketplace, and that's some incoming goods that might be checking at the port. Take a sample at the port before the product gets shipped to you. That might be checking product in the marketplace or somewhere in between. So that's a real key to look at that overall strategy. And then for my final slide before going on to the next Food Authenticity Network content, just implementation, our recommendations step by step. So for all companies, food companies, suppliers as well, the ready, aim, fire, remember that's not fire, ready, aim. The ready, aim, fire is the concept. A lot of times we see people make decisions in an emergency, and you've got to do that, but really there should be more planning. The first step is to prepare and review. Again, understand what's going on, what are the details. Second, read the reports and the links below. There's a lot of information that we have. Get familiar with the basics of what's food fraud, what's prevention, what are the systems in place if you don't understand that already. And then identify where you need more information, education, and training. So there'll be constantly new areas that you realize, maybe it's custom importation documents that are fraudulent, and there's a lot of resources there. You're identifying the need. So moving beyond that, if you're a food company, then determine your customer and legal requirement. Which laws, regulations, standards, or certifications are required to be compliant? So that could be a retailer asking you, or if you're a food company, it could be the suppliers as well. Ask your customers and their legal team. Start with the most basic requirements. Next, understand those compliance requirements. So it's one thing to see that you have to do, quote, testing, but what does that mean? What is a mass balance audit from the USDA National Organic Program? Then seek education and training on those requirements. There's a theme here. Understand your needs and go back and look at it. And then aim by defining how to start and how much is enough. That's for the food companies. And then the suppliers really here to identify your current product offerings in terms of food fraud prevention, not just detecting and the details of how much you can detect melamine at what levels. It's how does that activity help protect the supply chain of your customer, the entire supply chain mapping process, all of their products. And there's certain ways you can just expand your focus a little bit. It's not that complex once you understand that. Second, review if or how you support not only detect, deter, but prevent. And constantly prevention. Think about the big picture. And then third, do you have a way to train your customer and prospects on what they need to do? This is amazing. So a lot of customers will call you and ask for a test. Well, that's great. And you'll give them and sell the test, but they might not actually know why they're doing it. They might be in that mode of detect. They're just trying to check the species of that fish or the species of that meat or the other attributes of the product, but they don't realize beyond detect, there are these deter and prevention pieces. So there's ways for you, like things that we're offering here and through the Food Authenticity Network, education for your customers as well as you. So with that, that's the end of food fraud prevention, and we'll move on to look at the Food Authenticity Network. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for that very clear account of the essential components of the food fraud prevention strategy. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Food Authenticity Network, which is a complete resource that signposts a global good practice on food fraud mitigation and food authenticity testing. It was set up in July 2015 by the UK government as a direct response to the recommendations of the Elliott Report, and it's now led by LGC. The website brings together information on food authenticity testing and food fraud mitigation in one convenient location for the benefit of all stakeholders, helping to create more secure supply chains and ultimately to increase consumer confidence in the food label. Next slide, please. As you see, there are many features of the network, but I'll focus on a few key ones. Next slide, please. As the Elliott Review envisaged, the stakeholders now have direct access to named experts, 15 different food authenticity expert laboratories, and these are organised by 4 different areas. So we have 1 centre of expertise in the academic area, 9 laboratories that have a general proficiency across different techniques, commodities, and methods, and 3 centres of expertise that are experts in specific techniques, and 2 that are specific experts in specific commodities. Next slide, please. The output of UK government-funded research and surveys has been organised into methods, surveys, and nitrogen factor reports. And nitrogen factors are something that we use in the UK to determine meat and fish content. Next slide, please. We curate the latest information in terms of news and events on food authenticity testing and food fraud prevention. We have both member-based and open discussion boards, and as you can see, there have been very many discussions on a variety of food authenticity testing topics. And also, as John said, in recognition of the fact that the ultimate aim is to prevent the food fraud from happening, there is a food fraud mitigation section that's signposted practice in terms of tools, guidance, and reports. And we'll soon be adding to that with the definitions work that we're doing and the drivers report that I mentioned also. Last but not least, we have a training page that contains a lot of useful food authenticity testing training content, and that's been developed by a UK cross-government knowledge transfer project that's looking at improving standards in safety and standards analysis. Next slide. In response to the increasing number of reports that we saw during 2020 of the impact of COVID-19 and the fact that there is a perceived increased opportunity for food fraud to happen, Food Authenticity Network created a COVID-19 knowledge hub by gathering together all relevant information on our own website and signposting to other useful resources, so to help business continue to secure food supply chains by mitigating fraud. Next slide, please. In just over 5.5 years, the Food Authenticity Network has grown into a worldwide one with over 2,100 members from 81 different countries and territories. In addition, in 2020, we saw that over 21,500 unique users from 133 countries accessed the website. Next slide, please. All this wouldn't be possible without our supporters, who we are very grateful to for their continued support. There are many benefits to becoming a member of the Food Authenticity Network, including getting a monthly email with a roundup of our news called the Monthly Highlights email. So you can just click on the items that you're most interested in. As I said, it's completely free to join, so please do take the few minutes it takes to join and make use of all of these free resources. Now I'll hand over to Maura, who's going to talk to us about the role of testing in food fraud prevention. Next slide, please, and over to you, Maura. Thank you.
Thanks, Silverani. So thus far, you guys have listened to Silverani and John give a nice overview of food fraud and the necessity to have a process for detecting, deterring, and preventing food fraud and food adulteration. So what I'm going to do is start to wrap up the webinar with considerations in terms of how you do that. Because it's one thing to say, okay, we're going to put in place a system to detect what we think is being adulterated, but it's another thing to actually generate that data and to stand firm on that so that when the data comes under question, you can say, yes, this has happened and this is what we think has been adulterated in the food that we're looking at. So when it comes to food fraud testing, there's quite a number of things to be considered. everything from how you do your sampling. So is this a representative sample of the larger food? If it's part of a global food chain supply, you need to make sure that your sample is representative of that larger food source. Is the homogeneity representative, so that when you generate your test data, it has meaning and it actually can be extrapolated out to the larger food that you're impacting. Your equipment, is it well maintained? Are the methods for your equipment something that's going to generate valid data? Are you sampling in the right way? And then is everything that your developed method, is everything that went into that something that is certifiable? So can you guarantee that the calibrations are correct? Can you guarantee that the reagents are good? Can you guarantee that when you then go to measure a customer sample, it's a true unknown at that point, can you guarantee that the data that comes out is definitely going to represent what went in? So did you develop an entire workflow, an entire process that is accurate and reliable so that you know when you generate data and you present it out to a customer, to a court of law sometimes, if the data needs to be debated in court, can you stand behind that and say, here's why I know my data is accurate and it's reliable? And part of that goes into the reagents and the reference materials that were used to develop the method that generated the data that you're now presenting. And I say that like it's a trivial thing, but it's not. Unfortunately, these foods can present quite a challenge when it comes to developing a method, so that you know when you're taking, as John was mentioning, when you're looking at, for example, melamine in infant formula, when you take a sample of infant formula, you know that what all the other stuff that's in the infant formula that is supposed to be there did not get in the way of you determining whether there in fact was an adulteration at present, whether there's melamine in there, and if so, at what concentration was it in there. So you need to make sure that when you collected the samples, that they were collected the right way, they weren't tampered with, so that you can demonstrate what's commonly known as chain of custody, so that when they got to the lab, they hadn't been tampered with, they are representative of the larger food chain supplier or the food supplier, and that when you generated the data, that the data is correct. So there wasn't something else in the matrix that was getting in the way that was causing you to falsely report something like, in this case, melamine, when it wasn't actually there. And so one of the ways to do that, again, is to generate a method that is really robust and use reference materials that you know are highly accurate and are certified. And what we mean when we say certified is, what is the quality level of those reference materials? How are they accredited? So in the interest of time, I won't go into deep detail on accreditation levels. What I want you to take away from this is that there are different levels of accreditation, and not every laboratory, not every market sector needs the same level of accreditation. But what's important is that you understand what you do need to report your data against whatever regulatory method you're reporting against, and that your reference materials match the required accreditation. So if your reference materials are ISO 17025 certified, or if they're 17034 certified, or if this is a proficiency test standard and it's 17043 certified, you just need to understand what that means and which accreditation level you need so that you're meeting the requirements of the method that you're reporting against. So on this slide, there's a brief overview of what ISO 17025 accreditation means. And then that follows with basically an overview of what the equipment means, and then the traceability of the equipment and the method that's used to generate that reference material. And the detail on this slide isn't so important as it is to compare against what that means if you're looking at a 17034 ISO certified standard. So these are some of the general requirements for an ISO 17034 standard. And what's important is the difference between them, and that's on this slide. So in 17034 accreditation, you have a reference material manufacturer that is ISO certified to produce ISO 17034 reference materials. And that now means that there's an additional level of traceability. You should get a certificate with that reference material that tells you exactly what the unknown, the uncertainties around those measurements are, so that you can build that into your data. And that standard can be traced all the way back to the instruments and to the original raw materials that were used to produce it. So that if there's ever an error in the data, or if all of the uncertainties in your entire workflow need to be traced and need to be accounted for, you have a way to do that without having to do it yourself. So in this case, the vendor is taking on that responsibility. Again, 17025 accreditation now leaves that up to the laboratory to produce on their own, whereas 17034 accreditation does not. So you just need to understand what it is that you're getting with your reference materials and whether you need that additional level of ISO certification or not. And if not, then you need to understand how to account for that on your own. So with that, just for those of you who maybe are not familiar with the reference materials that we have sort of made reference to, no pun intended, Dr. Ehrensdorfer is a producer of reference materials and has been since 1975. Now, when the company started, it was just pesticide reference materials. However, pesticides, of course, are certainly used in the food and the agrochemical market sectors. And we have now branched into a global presence. We have manufacturing sites all over the world, and we produce many different reference materials that expand into food and food authenticity, and that includes dyes, it includes metabolites, nutritional composition, food fraud, additives, flavors, adulterants. So where we started in pesticides, we certainly do cover a much broader range now, but we do produce these at ISO 17034 quality levels, as well as 17025 to meet the needs of what a laboratory is looking for. So with that, I will turn it back over to John for conclusions, and then we'll follow up with references.
Great, thank you. You know, it's really interesting to look at food fraud in general, and you know, it's really interdisciplinary, and there's so much science, there's so much complexity to many of the steps. You know, so we here are talking about, and many experts in food authenticity and testing, but think about it, criminology. They've been studying this for, you know, situational crime prevention in the mid-70s, you know, policy, standards, management systems. And so it's important to know that there's a lot of these resources, and we put them together, and that's a key to look at all these different ideas, but then to give you some real key takeaways. So in conclusion, what we've talked about is just to clarify and just remind you that, you know, overall food fraud is an intentional act with the motivation for economic gain, and that's a key. We need to remember the big problem here. That's the problem. The problem isn't a testing problem. The problem is these human actors that are trying to deceive us. And the overriding driver for any kind of fraud is obviously to make money. So we're businesses, we're in business. We can think a little bit like the criminal because they're trying to continue to make money. And so anything we can do that disrupts their ability to make money, that's consistency or getting caught, is a good thing. So we can use our insight. And food fraud prevention systems need to be more than just detection. So someone might call for that one test to look at that one type of adulterant substance. But if you do look at the big picture, you'll probably help identify some areas that are really critical for that customer to be testing, either other types of similar products or similar types of raw materials. And that really leads to us talking about working in partnership, because sometimes those customers don't know what they need yet. They know that first step, but not the big picture. So you probably have experience with a wide range of similar issues. And so to increase your ability to help that customer will help everybody along the way. And that really then leads us into the real main conclusion is the role of food authenticity testing and monitoring is always to support and reinforce prevention. If we haven't heard that enough, we've got it here. So we'll build upon those basics and then really to start to think about the big picture. And with all of us, like with the Food Authenticity Network, you'll see a lot of resources, a lot of people that have been working together on an awful lot of this. So then I think it's back to Mara. on this, or me to finish?
Yep, thanks, John. So I just want to wrap up with a few additional resources. Like John was saying, food authenticity and food fraud prevention is sort of a moving target sometimes. And so sometimes your biggest challenge is where to find additional resources and to sort of read up on what you should be looking for next. So we've tried to provide a bunch of resources throughout the presentation, and I just wanted to wrap up with a few more. So we have a white paper that's on food fraud prevention in general, so it provides a nice overview on testing, monitoring, and strategy in general, and then it's coincided with a brochure for relevant reference materials that should help you in your development of a food fraud prevention strategy. Beyond that is a way to connect with us on social media. So these are either on LinkedIn or on Twitter. These are where you can find us online, and of course it's easier to keep up with what we're doing on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis there. It's also an additional resource, so feel free to connect with us on some of our social media outlets. And with that, I will just wrap up, and we will take any questions at this time. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, John, Savarani, and Moya. A really fantastic and insightful presentation there. As Moya just said, it is time for our Q&A session where today's speakers will answer your questions. You can still submit a question using the questions panel in the menu on the right. So we've had some questions come in, and the first one we have is directed to Savarani. Are there any food fraud standards which are globally applicable?
Oh, thank you very much for that. Yes, as I said in my talk, there is now quite a lot of interest in food fraud definitions from around the world, and there is recognition that actually having a common set of standards and definitions would be very helpful to people and will help facilitate international trade. So at the moment, there are multiple groups from around the world, including the one that I put on my slide, which is the European Standardization Organization, CEN, which has an agreement to work with ISO to produce this common terms. So we had the first working group meeting on the 19th of January. So hopefully over the next year or two, we'll be able to agree some definitions that will come across as an official standard. Codex Alimentarius have also now recognized that they need to have their own definition, and last year they set up a new working group. So these are the two major groups, but there's also other groups like GFSI that John mentioned, and AOEC and other groups like that looking at this too. So very soon we'll have some standard terms. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Savarani. Yes, of course, John, please do.
Yeah, I might add to that. It's interesting to look at that. And so I've been involved with actually ISO back when it was product fraud starting in 2009 with Codex. Actually, last Friday was the US Codex Alimentarius team talking about food fraud. Really a key is to look at where there is a trigger or a force for companies to lead with compliance. And that's really the Global Food Safety Initiative is really a key, because to get food safety certification, you have to complete the entire food safety management system defined by GFSI, which includes addressing food fraud. And GFSI has a specific definition of food fraud and specific scope. So if you're looking at your customer, you might think that stolen goods should be in or out, but the bottom line is those food companies have to implement it to that type of definition. So that's interesting to look at what's in practice and then what's in some of the laws and how it fits. Basically, all types of food fraud are illegal under one type of law or another. Just might be not one of the laws that you're specifically used to working with. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Moya, we have a question for you. Is there a difference between ISO Guide 34 and ISO 17034?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There is a difference, and it's subtle. So with a lot of regulatory methods, they start out in draft or in guide form. And this is no different. So this is where back in 2009, it was Guide 34, and it was to guide laboratories and to guide them in the use of reference materials and to guide manufacturers of these reference materials. In 2016, it became an international standard. So it got published as an officially accepted method, ISO 17034. So it became part of the 17,000 series of ISO methods. It then supersedes Guide 34 and now becomes a requirement. So now it's prescriptive. You need to now follow exactly what's in that standard to produce a 17034 quality standard. If you don't follow what's in 1703 ISO 17034, you cannot put 17034 quality on your reference material. So it now supersedes Guide 34 and that was published back in 2016. So it now supersedes Guide 34. It's a subtle difference, but it's important.
Thank you very much. We have a question now for Selvarani, please. Can you please give as examples of FF incidents database relevant to the European market?
Sorry, just missed the first bit of that.
Could you please give an example of FF incidents database relevant to the European market?
XS, was that?
F for Freddie.
Okay.
Possibly the food fraud, like a food fraud incident database, a global database versus the more detailed ones.
I would think so. We'll run with that.
Okay.
John. So the food fraud incident
yeah, say
database.
food fraud incidents versus RASIF. That's a great question.
Yeah. So if they're talking about the rapid food safety alert system that's run by the European Commission, so this is a database that's run from, I think, the 1970s that highlights food safety incident alerts across Europe. Now, there isn't an equivalent system per se for food fraud, although the 2013 incident highlighted this, and the European Commission put in together their food fraud prevention plan and cooperation system that means the EU 28, as it was then, were bound to share information on food fraud incidents that happened across the world. If you're talking about open access databases, well, to my knowledge, there aren't very many open access databases. There are horizon scanning databases like the USB food fraud database that is now operated by Discernis. There is the Horizon Scan system by FERA that's run in the UK. And there's a new system that we came across in the light of our work called Safety HUD that's operated by Mero Nutrasciences. All of these are subscription-based databases that look on past historical food fraud incidents and then give you an assessment of what mitigation strategies you need to have in place based on commodity types. So in the true sense, they can't predict what's going to happen next, which is obviously what we all want, but it's a very difficult thing to do. But they can tell you based on a historical incidents, what are the likely risks in your commodity. And we'll see through history, actually, a lot of the food fraud incidents we've seen now have occurred 100 years ago, maybe 500 years ago. So they do have a way of repeating themselves. So that's not a bad strategy. So if you wanted to come in on that, John.
Yeah, to add on that, that's something the real key is so if you're new to food fraud as a problem and you're looking at your own company, the incident databases are a great place to look because you can see what's happened in history. You at least know what's already out there. You're not just searching the internet yourself. Someone else has curated that. A real key with RASIF is that's actually coming from a regulatory body, as would be the FDA recall alerts or things like that. But one challenge to be careful of with RASIF in the adulteration and fraud section is that is intentional and unintentional fraud. Say that product has incorrect weight. So you think you're buying 50 pounds of fish and the scale was off and it's really only 40 pounds of fish. Both of those would be in that database. So if you see fish weight fraud occurring, you really do need to be careful to look at to see if that was intentional or unintentional. Now, even if it's unintentional, it's good to find out because you know that some of these suppliers have a problem with their scales or supposedly have problems with their scales. You're learning what fraud's occurring. So they're all valuable. But again, it's looking at it and understanding, why it was developed and what's the nature of that data set.
And just to finish up on that point, Sorry, I just wanted
Yes.
to finally say that for people that are looking for these types of resources, these are all signposted on the Food Authenticity Network under the Food Fraud Mitigation section, so you can find all of the major global tools and resources there, so please do visit the site.
As I was saying, thank you so much for that comprehensive response. I'm sure part of that would have answered their question. Next question that we have is directed to Moya. What is the difference between reference material and standard compound?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it's sort of like, what's your definition of detection limit, right? So it can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And it's important that you just be clear about what that means. So I've heard reference material, standard reference material, certified reference material, and standard material all used interchangeably over my career. And sometimes it's not meant that way. It's just in how you define it. So typically, a reference material implies that it's made by an ISO certified reference material producer. However, that doesn't always mean that it has a certain level of accreditation. So you could be meaning that this is a reference material that comes with a certificate and it's produced at ISO 17034 quality, but that doesn't necessarily mean that. It's not like default implied in the definition. So typically reference material implies some level of documented uncertainty in the production of that standard. And standard can be a little bit more loosely defined, where you could even be talking about a solvent or a reagent at that point. So typically the difference is in the uncertainty and that's documented, or whether there's a certificate that's provided with that product and when it's produced. But again, it's just really good to be clear when you use the term, how you're defining it, so that there's no ambiguity.
Thank you very much. We've got a question here for John. What are the approaches for organic food fraud detection? Often final product is produced in one country, but some ingredients are produced in different countries. How can we make sure that imported products are really organic? We can't trust certification.
Well, I won't say agree completely that you can't trust certification. What I will say is that there's a fraud opportunity. And a real key, that's been a real focus for the USDA and the National Organic Program. Actually, yesterday, I was on a training session for their inspectors, and they have a new strengthening organic enforcement rule. What it's doing is they're looking at all the different ways that there could be fraudulent activity, and then requiring companies, if they want to have the USDA organic certificate, the label, that they have to meet these other requirements. Now, if you're across Europe, you might say, well, we don't care about the US. But I bet there's a lot of you, if you're in the organic production business, the US is a market for you. So you would be seeking US certification probably. A key is to step back, just like we did throughout the program, is to look at the fraud opportunity, to look at things like incident databases, look in the USDA's website of fraudulent documents. They have fraudulent documents posted there. So you can see what they know and what's sometimes off about those documents. So you look at the type of incident that occur, and then you put plans in place to validate it. You know, something could be when you receive the USDA certificate, you check the USDA website to make sure that the company is up to date. You could also then look for the type of fraud that occurs. Maybe it's like pesticide residue. Then you could go back to like what Maura was talking about, to look at those reference samples and then test for it, to look for it. You could do traceability audits. You could do mass balance audits of your suppliers. So if they say if they're selling you 1,000 pounds of something and you find they can only make 800 pounds, then there's some questions there. So we basically look at the fraud opportunity, look at incidents that are in the marketplace, and then put plans in place to try to prevent it. Because remember, these fraudsters usually are very skittish. They're invested in the business. They're very scared of getting caught. So you put some plans in place, you probably will lead to prevention.
Thank you so much, John. Some really good advice there. Unfortunately, that is all we do have time for today, but any unanswered questions will be responded to via email. Thank you so much to our three speakers for your time. I'm sure you've all enjoyed it as much as I have. As you leave the webinar, a survey will appear on your screen asking you to rate the session. Please take a moment to provide your feedback. If now is not a good time, the survey will be sent to you shortly via email, and we'd greatly appreciate it if you could complete this when you can. On behalf of New Food and LGC, I'd like to thank you all for attending today's webinar. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.